The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, and when I finally looked out my cabin window that Friday morning in January, I couldn't even see my driveway anymore because there was a 6-foot wall of compressed ice and snow blocking the entire entrance. I'm Blake Morrison, and I'd bought this cabin in Pine Ridge, Colorado about 8 months earlier as a weekend retreat from my tech consulting business in Denver. The place was perfect, nestled in the mountains about 2 hours from the city, quiet and peaceful. Or at least it was supposed to be. When I'd purchased the property, the real estate agent had glossed over the HOA requirements, calling it a small community organization that just keeps things running smoothly. That should have been my first warning sign. The Pine Ridge Mountain Community Association was run by a woman named Brenda Sheffield, a 52-year-old former real estate developer who treated the HOA like it was her personal fiefdom. She had rules for everything: what color you could paint your mailbox, how tall your grass could be even though we were in the mountains, and apparently, which snow removal company you were required to use. I grabbed my phone and called the number for Mountain Peak Snow Services, the HOA mandated contractor. After 6 rings, a gruff voice answered. "Yeah, Mountain Peak. Hi, this is Blake Morrison up at 4782 Aspen Trail. Your plow just buried my driveway completely. I can't get out." "Yeah, we plow the main roads. That's what we're contracted for." "I understand that, but you pushed all the snow directly into my driveway entrance. There's got to be 6 feet of packed snow blocking me in." The man on the other end sighed loudly. "Look, buddy, we clear the roads. What happens to the snow after that isn't our problem. You want your driveway cleared, that's on you. But I literally cannot get out to clear it myself. My truck is in the garage and the garage opens to the driveway that you've blocked. Not my problem. Call the HOA if you've got complaints." He hung up. I stood there staring at my phone in disbelief. I'd been coming up to the cabin every weekend for months without major issues, but this was my first winter here. I tried the HOA emergency line next. "Pine Ridge Mountain Community Association. This is Brenda speaking." Her voice was clipped and professional in that way that immediately put you on guard. "Hi, Brenda. This is Blake Morrison. The Snowplow service blocked my driveway completely and I can't get out. They said it's not their responsibility." "Well, Mr. Morrison, Mountain Peak Snow Services is contracted to clear the main community roads, which they've done. Individual driveway maintenance is the responsibility of each homeowner. They didn't just leave snow on my driveway, Brenda. They actively pushed a massive wall of it directly blocking my entrance. That's the nature of snowplowing, Mr. Morrison. The snow has to go somewhere. Perhaps you should have been more proactive about clearing it as they worked. It's 6 in the morning and they came through at some point during the night. Then I suggest you invest in a good snow blower. Will there be anything else?" I felt my jaw tighten. "Yes, actually, I'd like to hire a different snow removal company to clear my driveway." There was a pause. "That won't be possible." "Excuse me." Section 14, Paragraph 8 of the HOA Covenant clearly states that only HOA-approved contractors may perform services within the community. Mountain Peak Snow Services is our exclusive snow removal contractor. So I can't even hire someone to clear my own driveway. Not unless they're on our approved vendor list. And currently, we only have one approved vendor for snow services. It prevents conflicts and ensures quality control. Quality control? I'm literally trapped in my house. "Mr. Morrison, I don't appreciate your tone. You agreed to these covenants when you purchased your property. If you'll excuse me, I have other calls to attend to." She hung up. I stood there in my cabin, looking out at the wall of snow, feeling my frustration build. I dealt with difficult clients, unreasonable deadlines, and corporate politics in my career, but this was something else entirely. This was someone telling me I couldn't even hire someone to dig myself out of my own property. I spent the next hour trying to figure out solutions. I called 3 different snow removal companies in the area, and all of them gave me the same answer. They couldn't work in Pine Ridge without HOA approval, and Brenda Sheffield had made it clear to everyone in the area that only Mountain Peak was allowed. One guy who ran a small operation out of Evergreen was more honest about it. "Look, man, I'd love to help you, but Sheffield has connections with the county. Last guy who tried to work in Pine Ridge without her approval ended up getting audited by every regulatory agency imaginable. His business license got challenged, his insurance got questioned, all kinds of harassment. It's not worth it." That's when I realized this wasn't just about snow removal. This was about control. I changed into my snow gear and decided to dig myself out manually. It took me 4.5 hours with a shovel to clear enough space to even open my garage door. By the time I'd made a path wide enough for my truck, my back was screaming and my hands were blistered even through my gloves. The packed snow that the plow had pushed was like concrete. I finally got my truck out around 2 in the afternoon, only to discover that the plow had come through again while I was working on the lower section of my driveway, pushing another wall of snow across the entrance. I actually yelled in frustration, my voice echoing off the pine trees. This time I didn't bother calling anyone. I just got back to work with my shovel. Another 2 hours later, I'd cleared it again. I drove down to the local hardware store in the town of Pine Ridge proper, about 15 minutes away, and bought the biggest snow blower they had in stock. The clerk, a guy in his 60s named Tom, gave me a knowing look. "Let me guess, you're up in the mountain community?" "That obvious. We sell a lot of these to folks up there. Mountain Peak has a reputation for being terrible." Tom glanced around even though we were the only ones in the store. "For being connected to Brenda Sheffield. Her nephew owns the company." That stopped me cold. "Her nephew?" "Yeah, Danny Sheffield. Brenda made sure when she took over the HOA 5 years ago that Mountain Peak became the exclusive contractor. Pays them about $60,000 a year from HOA fees. Not a bad deal when you can plow the roads however you want and homeowners can't complain." "That seems like a massive conflict of interest." Tom shrugged. "Probably is, but who's going to fight it? Most of the folks up there are weekend warriors like yourself. The full-time residents are either on Brenda's side or too old to care." I loaded the snow blower into my truck and headed back up the mountain. Sure enough, by the time I got back to my cabin around 5:30, the plow had come through yet again, leaving another pile across my driveway. This one wasn't as bad since I'd bought myself some clearance, but it was clearly intentional. There were other properties on my street, and while they all had some snow pushed toward their driveways, none of them had the deliberate wall that kept appearing at mine. I used my new snow blower to clear it, which was significantly easier than the shovel, and then I sat down in my cabin to think. I'd built my consulting business from nothing into a 7-figure operation over the past decade. I'd negotiated with Fortune 500 executives and navigated corporate politics that would make Machiavelli proud. I wasn't about to be pushed around by a small-town HOA president and her nephew's Snowplow company. The next morning, Saturday, I drove back to town and stopped at the county clerk's office. They were open limited hours on weekends, but I managed to catch someone who helped me pull the HOA's corporate records and bylaws. I spent 3 hours in their office reading through every document they had on file for the Pine Ridge Mountain Community Association. What I found was interesting. The HOA had 37 properties in total. To change the bylaws required a majority vote of homeowners. The current board consisted of Brenda Sheffield as president, her friend Patricia Lambert as vice president, and a retired accountant named George Hendricks as treasurer. Secretary position had been vacant for 6 months. More interesting was the financial disclosure. The HOA collected yearly dues of $1,800 per property, which should have meant about $66,000 in annual revenue. According to the filed statements, they were paying Mountain Peak Snow Services $58,000 per year, with another $15,000 going to administrative expenses, which seemed high for an organization with no office and no staff besides the volunteer board members. I made copies of everything and took them back to my cabin. That night, I sent an email to the HOA board requesting copies of the last 3 years of detailed financial statements, as was my right under Colorado law governing homeowners associations. Brenda's response came within an hour, even though it was 8 o'clock on a Saturday night. Mr. Morrison, financial statements are provided at the annual meeting. The next meeting is scheduled for March. Your request is noted. I replied immediately. Colorado Revised Statutes 3833.3317 states that I have the right to examine HOA records within 24 hours of a reasonable request. This is a formal request under that statute. Her next response took longer. The records are not kept in a format that can be immediately shared. We will compile them and make them available at the HOA office. What HOA office? The bylaws list your home address as the official address. No response. Sunday morning, the plow came through at 6 a.m. I know because I was watching. The driver, who I assumed was Danny Sheffield, deliberately angled his plow to push the maximum amount of snow directly into my driveway entrance. I recorded it on my phone from my window. He made 3 passes on my street, and each time he specifically positioned his truck to dump snow at my property. I was outside with my snow blower before he'd even finished his route. As he came back around, I flagged him down. He was a guy in his early 30s, heavy-set, with the kind of sneer that told me Tom at the hardware store had been right about everything. "You're blocking my driveway intentionally," I called out. He rolled down his window. "I'm clearing the road, man. Not my fault where the snow goes." "I have you on video specifically angling your plow to dump it in my driveway." "Yeah, so what? You going to complain to the HOA?" He laughed. "Good luck with that. I'm going to do more than that." "Whatever, man. Maybe you should move if you don't like mountain living." He rolled up his window and drove off. I stood there in the pre-dawn cold, watching his taillights disappear down the road, and made a decision. This wasn't about snow anymore. This was about a corrupt system that needed to be dismantled. Monday morning, I drove back to Denver and went straight to my lawyer's office. Sarah Chen had been my corporate attorney for 6 years, handling everything from contract negotiations to business acquisitions for my consulting firm. She listened to my story while taking notes on her tablet. "So you want to sue the HOA?" she asked when I finished. "I want to know what my options are." Sarah leaned back in her chair. "HOA disputes are tricky. Colorado law does give homeowners rights, but enforcement can be slow and expensive. We could file for access to the financial records, which you'd likely win. We could also potentially challenge the exclusive contractor arrangement as a conflict of interest, especially given the family relationship. But it'll take months, maybe years. And in the meantime, you're still stuck with the situation. Plus, HOA law is its own specialized field. I can handle it, but I'd honestly recommend someone who focuses on that area." "What if I went at it from a different angle? What are you thinking?" I'd been mulling over an idea since Saturday night. What if I bought Mountain Peak Snow Services? Sarah raised her eyebrows. That's certainly a creative approach, but would they even sell? Everyone has a price. And from what I saw in the county records, it's not exactly a massive operation. One guy, a few trucks, some equipment. How hard could it be to make an offer? Blake, even if you bought it, the HOA could just switch contractors. Could they? What if the contract has terms that make it expensive to break? What if I start providing excellent service and homeowners actually like the company? Sarah smiled. You're thinking about this like a business acquisition. Because that's what it is. Brenda Sheffield thinks she controls everything up there because she controls the services. What if I start controlling the services instead? It's risky. You could spend money on this company and end up with nothing if they just change contractors. I'll review the contract first. And honestly, I'm doing well enough that even if this costs me some money, it'll be worth it for the satisfaction of watching Brenda's face when she realizes what happened. Sarah laughed. All right, let's say I support this admittedly insane plan. What do you need from me? Help me structure an offer to buy the company. Something that looks legitimate and professional, and help me review that HOA contract to understand what we're working with. Over the next week, I did my research. Mountain Peak Snow Services was a relatively small operation. Danny Sheffield had founded it 4 years ago, right after his aunt had taken over the HOA. Besides the Pine Ridge contract, he had maybe 5 or 6 other small commercial clients. He owned 3 trucks outright and leased another 2. Total annual revenue looked to be around $90,000, with the HOA contract being his biggest single client by far. I drove up to Pine Ridge that Thursday and stopped by Danny's office, which was really just a garage bay he rented on the outskirts of town. He was there working on one of the trucks when I arrived. Danny Sheffield, I called out as I walked in. He looked up from under the hood, and I saw the recognition in his eyes. You're that guy from Aspen Trail who keeps complaining. Blake Morrison. I wanted to talk to you about your business. I'm not changing how I plow. Talk to the HOA if you've got a problem. I'm not here to complain. I'm here to make you an offer. That got his attention. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked over. What kind of offer? I want to buy Mountain Peak Snow Services. Danny stared at me for a long moment, then laughed. You're joking. I'm completely serious. I'll pay you $200,000 for the business. All equipment, contracts, client lists, everything. His laugh died. 200 grand, cash deal. We can close within 30 days. I could see the wheels turning in his head. For a guy running a small plow company in a mountain town, $200,000 was serious money. But suspicion quickly replaced his surprise. Why would you want to buy a snowplow company? I'm looking to diversify my investments. I've got a consulting business that runs itself most of the time, and I like the idea of owning a service company in an area where I have property. Seems like a good fit. This is because of the driveway thing, isn't it? This is a legitimate business offer. You've got steady contracts and good equipment. I'm willing to pay above market value because I want to move quickly. But if you're not interested, I can look at starting my own competing service. That last part was the hook. If I started a competing service, Danny would likely lose some of his other clients even if he kept the HOA contract. And starting a new service would mean I could potentially challenge the exclusive arrangement through other means. I need to think about it, he said finally. You've got 72 hours. After that, the offer drops to $150. I handed him my business card and walked out. Sarah called me that night. I got a copy of the HOA contract with Mountain Peak. You were right to be suspicious. It's a 5-year agreement with auto renewal, And there's a termination clause that requires 90 days notice and a $10,000 penalty for early termination without cause. So if they fire Mountain Peak, they owe 10 grand. Exactly. And the contract defines adequate service very loosely. Basically, as long as Mountain Peak clears the main roads, they're fulfilling their obligations. Individual driveway issues aren't mentioned. Perfect. That means if I own the company, they can't easily get rid of me without paying that penalty. Blake, have you considered that this might escalate things? Brenda Sheffield doesn't seem like the type to take this lying down. Good, I'm counting on it. Danny called me 2 days later. I'll take the deal, but I want $225. I'd expected him to counter. $210, and you stay on for 30 days to help with the transition. Deal. We met at Sarah's office the following week with Danny's lawyer, a small-town attorney who seemed way out of his depth. Sarah had drawn up the purchase agreement, and we went through it line by line. Danny would transfer ownership of all equipment, client contracts, and the business name. He'd stay on as a paid consultant for 30 days to help me learn the routes and equipment. He'd also sign a non-compete preventing him from starting another snow removal service within 50 miles for 2 years. When we signed the papers, and I transferred the money, I saw the relief on Danny's face. He'd probably been barely making ends meet, and suddenly he had enough cash to do whatever he wanted. His lawyer looked pleased too, probably because this was the easiest money he'd made in months. Pleasure doing business with you, Danny said as we shook hands. There was something in his expression, though, a knowing smirk that made me think he knew exactly why I was buying the company and found it amusing. Good luck dealing with Aunt Brenda. Thanks. I'll need it. The next step was informing the HOA of the ownership change. According to the contract, any change in ownership had to be reported within 15 days, but there was no provision requiring HOA approval of new owners. It was a loophole that Brenda had probably never considered necessary, since she never imagined Danny would sell. I sent a formal letter to the HOA board, CCing all the addresses listed in the records. Dear Pine Ridge Mountain Community Association Board, this letter serves as formal notice that Mountain Peak Snow Services has been acquired by Morrison Service Solutions, LLC, effective immediately. All existing contracts and service agreements remain in full effect. The new ownership is committed to providing excellent service to the Pine Ridge community. Please direct all future correspondence regarding snow removal to the contact information below. I received an email from Brenda within 2 hours. Mr. Morrison, we need to discuss this matter immediately. Please call me at your earliest convenience. I waited until the next day to respond. Brenda, as the new owner of Mountain Peak Snow Services, I'm happy to discuss any service concerns you might have. My office hours are Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. Feel free to schedule a time. Her response was icy. This is highly irregular and possibly a violation of our HOA covenants. I'm calling an emergency board meeting. You're welcome to hold whatever meetings you'd like. The business transfer is completely legal, and the existing contract remains valid. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for that Friday evening. I made sure to attend as both a homeowner and as the contractor. The meeting was held at the Pine Ridge Community Center, a small building that mostly hosted weekend craft fairs and local events. When I walked in, there were about 15 homeowners in attendance, which was more than I expected. Brenda sat at the front table with Patricia Lambert and George Hendricks. All three of them looked at me with barely concealed hostility. Let's call this meeting to order, Brenda said sharply. We're here to discuss the recent unauthorized change in our snow removal contractor. Point of order, I said, standing up. There hasn't been a change in contractors. Mountain Peak Snow Services is still your contractor. There's simply been a change in ownership. A change that creates a massive conflict of interest, Brenda shot back. You're a homeowner in this community, and now you own the service company we contract with. Interesting that conflict of interest concerns you now, but didn't when your nephew owned the company. The room went quiet. I could see several homeowners exchanging glances. Apparently not everyone had known about that relationship. Brenda's face flushed red. That was a completely different situation. Danny started his business independently and immediately got a 5-year exclusive contract with the HOA you run. Very independent. I kept my voice calm and professional. But that's beside the point. I've purchased a legitimate business and intend to honor all existing contracts. Colorado law doesn't prohibit homeowners from providing services to their HOA. George Hendricks spoke up for the first time. He was a thin man in his 70s with a quiet voice. I think we need to have the HOA attorney review this situation. By all means, I said. But while you're having them review this, you might want to ask them about Colorado revised statutes 3833.3302, which requires HOA board members to disclose any conflicts of interest. I'm curious if Brenda properly disclosed her relationship to the previous owner of Mountain Peak. Brenda stood up abruptly. This meeting is about your improper acquisition of our contractor, not about making baseless accusations against the board. They're not baseless. They're documented fact. Danny Sheffield is your nephew. That's public record. An older woman in the second row raised her hand. Brenda, is that true? Is Danny your nephew? That's irrelevant to this discussion. I think it's very relevant, another homeowner said, a man in his 50s. We're paying that company almost $60,000 a year. If there's a family connection that wasn't disclosed, that's a problem. The meeting devolved from there. Homeowners started asking questions about the HOA's finances, about the snow removal contract, about why they weren't getting better service for what they were paying. Brenda tried to maintain control, but the cat was out of the bag. Finally, Patricia Lambert called for a motion to terminate the contract with Mountain Peak Snow Services. We can find another contractor, one without these conflicts. That will cost you $10,000 in early termination penalties, I pointed out. Plus, you'll need to find a new contractor, negotiate a new agreement, and hope they're willing to start mid-season. Most snow removal companies are already fully booked. He's right, George said quietly. The termination clause is in our existing agreement. I reviewed it before this meeting. Brenda glared at him. Whose side are you on, George? I'm on the side of fiscal responsibility. We don't have $10,000 in reserves to pay a termination penalty. Then we'll raise a special assessment, Brenda said. That caused an uproar. Special assessments required homeowner approval, and nobody wanted to pay extra because the board had messed up their contractor relationship. I let the chaos play out for a few minutes before speaking up again. I have a proposal. Give me the rest of the winter season. Let me prove that Mountain Peak can provide good service under new ownership. If homeowners aren't satisfied by March, I'll voluntarily terminate the contract with no penalty. If they are satisfied, we renegotiate the terms for next year. It was a calculated risk, but I'd thought it through. I knew I could provide better service than Danny had been providing because the bar was incredibly low. All I had to do was plow the roads without deliberately blocking driveways, and I'd be an improvement. The homeowners looked intrigued. Brenda looked furious. That's not an acceptable solution. Why not? The older woman asked. Seems fair to me. We're stuck with the contract anyway because of the penalty. Might as well see if the new owner is better than the old one. A vote was called. 14 homeowners were in attendance besides Brenda, Patricia, and George. 12 voted to accept my proposal. Only Brenda and Patricia voted against. George abstained, which earned him another glare from Brenda. "Fine," Brenda said coldly, "but I'll be documenting every single service issue. One mistake, Morrison, and you're done." "I look forward to exceeding your expectations," I replied. After the meeting, several homeowners came up to talk to me. Most of them were relieved to hear there might be better service coming. A few shared their own stories of driveways being deliberately blocked, of calling Mountain Peak for help and being ignored, of Brenda shutting down any complaints. One couple, the Martins, told me they'd been thinking about selling their place just to get away from the HOA drama. "We've been here 8 years, and it's gotten so much worse since Brenda took over. She treats this place like she owns it." I drove home that night feeling cautiously optimistic. I'd managed to secure my position at least through the winter, and I'd exposed the previous conflict of interest. But I knew Brenda wasn't going to make this easy. The next snowfall came 3 days later. I'd spent the intervening time going through Mountain Peak's equipment with Danny, learning the routes and systems. The trucks were in decent shape, though they'd been maintained minimally. I had a mechanic friend from Denver come up and do a thorough inspection, replacing worn parts and making sure everything was road safe. When the snow started falling Tuesday night, I was ready. I'd plotted out the most efficient route through Pine Ridge, taking into account where the snow should be pushed to minimize driveway blockage. I'd also reviewed every property, noting which driveways were at angles that made them vulnerable to snow accumulation. I started plowing at 4 a.m. Wednesday morning. Instead of just pushing snow to the sides randomly, I carefully angled each pass to push snow into the empty areas between properties, or into the designated snow storage areas that the community technically had but Danny had never bothered using. Where driveways were vulnerable, I made extra passes to clear the entrances properly. It took me an extra 2 hours compared to Danny's usual route, but when I finished, every driveway in Pine Ridge was accessible. I took photos of each street, documenting the work. My phone started ringing around 8 a.m. The first call was from the Martins. "Blake, I don't know what you did differently, but our driveway is completely clear. This is the first time in 3 years we've been able to pull straight out after a snow." More calls came throughout the day. Homeowners thanking me, expressing surprise, asking if this was really going to be the new standard. I assured everyone it was. The only call that wasn't positive came from Brenda at 10 a.m. "Mr. Morrison, you took 5 hours to complete a route that should take 3. That's inefficient and not cost-effective. The contract specifies that main roads must be cleared and accessible. It doesn't specify how long that should take. I'm ensuring quality service. You're wasting time and resources. I'm doing the job properly. If you'd like to document this as a service issue, please feel free. I'm sure the other homeowners will be interested to hear that you're complaining about driveways being too clear." She hung up without responding. Over the next few weeks, I established a pattern. Every snowfall, I'd plow carefully and thoroughly. I started a group email list for Pine Ridge homeowners, sending updates about weather forecasts and planned plowing schedules. I made myself available for questions and concerns. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Homeowners who'd been frustrated for years were suddenly happy with their snow service. Some started mentioning other issues with the HOA, other areas where Brenda's management had been lacking. George Hendricks called me one evening in mid-February. "Blake, I wanted to give you a heads up. Brenda's planning to challenge your contractor status at the March annual meeting. She's going to claim breach of contract." "On what grounds?" She's documenting everything. Your longer plow times, your equipment costs, anything she can use. She's building a case that you're not providing cost-effective service. But the homeowners are happy. Doesn't matter to her. She wants you gone, and she's not going to stop until she makes that happen. George, can I ask you something? Why are you still on the board with her? There was a long pause. Because I'm hoping to be there when she finally goes too far. Someone needs to be watching what she does. Patricia just goes along with whatever Brenda wants, but I can at least slow things down sometimes. I appreciate the warning. There's something else. I've been looking at the HOA finances more closely since your takeover raised questions. There are some discrepancies in the administrative expenses. Money that's being paid out, but I can't find corresponding services. How much money? About $5,000 a year for the last 3 years. It's categorized as management consulting fees, but there's no contract or documentation of what those fees are for. You think Brenda's embezzling. I think something's not right, but I'm just the treasurer. I can raise questions, but I can't force an audit without board approval, and Brenda controls the board. This was bigger than I'd thought. George, would you be willing to formally request those records? As treasurer, you have that authority. I could, but Brenda would just stonewall me like she did with your request. Maybe, but it would be documented. And if we can show a pattern of financial irregularities, that's grounds for a formal investigation. You're thinking about going after her. I'm thinking about protecting the homeowners and making sure the HOA is being run properly. If that means investigating Brenda, then yes. George was quiet for a moment. All right. I'll make a formal request at the next board meeting. But Blake, be careful. Brenda has friends in this county. She's not going to take this lightly. The February board meeting was the following week. I attended again, and this time there were even more homeowners present. Word was spreading that something was happening with the HOA. George brought up his request for detailed financial records during the treasurer's report. I'd like to see the invoices and documentation for all administrative expenses over the past 3 years. I'm having trouble reconciling some of the categorizations. Brenda's expression didn't change. Those records are available for review. I'll have them for you at next month's meeting. I'd actually like them within the legally required time frame, which is 24 hours for a board member request. George, I'm not sure why you're being difficult about this. I'm not being difficult. I'm doing my job as treasurer, which includes ensuring our finances are properly documented. Several homeowners started paying closer attention. One man raised his hand. I'd like to see those records too. As a homeowner, don't I have that right? The financial statements are provided at the annual meeting, Brenda said, her voice tight. But detailed records should be available for review, I added. Colorado law is very clear about that. Brenda stood up abruptly. Fine. Anyone who wants to review records can schedule an appointment. But this board meeting is not going to turn into an inquisition. Nobody's trying to create an inquisition, George said calmly. We're just asking for transparency. The meeting ended shortly after, but the damage was done. Homeowners were talking among themselves, questioning what was being hidden and why Brenda was so defensive. I received a letter the next day via certified mail. It was from an attorney representing the HOA, claiming that I was in breach of contract for excessive service provision that exceeded budgeted amounts, and demanding that I reduce my plowing time or face termination. I called Sarah immediately. They're trying to claim I'm breaching the contract by doing too good a job. She laughed when I read her the letter. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. The contract specifies service requirements, not maximum service levels. This won't hold up. So how do I respond? I'll draft a response. But Blake, this tells me they're getting desperate. When people start threatening legal action over nonsense claims, it means they don't have anything real to work with. Sarah's response was perfect. She calmly pointed out that the contract had no provisions limiting service quality or time, that homeowner satisfaction was demonstrably higher under new management, and that any attempt to terminate the contract without cause would result in immediate legal action for the penalty clause plus damages for wrongful termination. We heard nothing back for 2 weeks. Then the county inspector showed up. I was at the garage bay working on one of the trucks when a woman in a county jacket walked in with a clipboard. "Are you Blake Morrison, owner of Mountain Peak Snow Services?" "That's me. Can I help you?" "I'm Linda Rodriguez from the county licensing office. We've received a complaint about your business operation and I'm here to conduct an inspection." "A complaint about what?" "Multiple issues. Equipment safety, proper licensing, environmental compliance for snow storage, vehicle registration. I need to see all your paperwork and inspect your equipment." I spent the next 3 hours pulling every document, registration, and license I had. Linda was thorough, going through every piece of paper and examining every truck in detail. I could tell she was looking for violations. Finally, she stood up and closed her clipboard. "Everything appears to be in order. Your registrations are current, licenses are valid, and equipment meets safety standards. So there's no issue, not that I can find. The snow storage locations you're using are designated areas, so that's compliant too." She hesitated. "Off the record, I've done about 6 of these inspections this year on complaints from the same source. All businesses that happen to be working in Pine Ridge. None of them had violations either." "Let me guess. Brenda Sheffield filed the complaints." Linda's expression told me I was right. "I can't confirm who files complaints, but you might want to make sure all your documentation stays current and easily accessible. Something tells me this won't be the last inspection you get." After she left, I called Sarah again. "We need to start documenting everything. Every interaction with Brenda, every inspection, every attempt to interfere with the business. We're building a harassment case. Already on it. I've been keeping a file since the beginning." The March annual meeting was approaching, and I knew it was going to be the showdown. Brenda had spent the past month trying every angle she could to get rid of me, and none of them had worked. Now she'd have to face the homeowners directly. I spent the week before the meeting preparing. I put together a presentation showing the service improvements since I'd taken over. I had photos comparing driveway conditions under Danny's management versus mine. I had testimonials from homeowners. I'd even done a cost analysis showing that, despite my longer plow times, the actual cost per household was lower because I wasn't causing damage to driveways or property that required repairs. The annual meeting was held on a Saturday afternoon in early March at the community center. The parking lot was full, which I took as a good sign. When everyone cares enough to show up, it means they're paying attention. Brenda called the meeting to order promptly at 2 p.m. There were 31 people in attendance, representing 28 of the 37 properties. That was unprecedented participation. The meeting started with standard HOA business. Reading of minutes, treasurer's report, president's update. George delivered the financial report, noting again that he was still waiting for detailed documentation on several expense categories. Brenda glossed over that comment quickly. Then came the snow removal contract discussion. "As you all know, there was an ownership change in our snow removal contractor mid-season," Brenda began. "At the emergency meeting in January, we agreed to evaluate the service through the end of winter. That evaluation period is now complete, and I'm recommending that we terminate our contract with Mountain Peak Snow Services and seek a new contractor for next season." "On what grounds?" someone called out. "The service has been inefficient and costly. The new owner has spent significantly more time on plowing routes, which will drive up our costs. Additionally, there are significant conflict of interest concerns with a homeowner serving as a contractor." I raised my hand. "May I present the homeowner perspective?" Brenda looked like she wanted to refuse, but with the room full of people, she couldn't. "Fine. 5 minutes." I stood and handed out the packets I'd prepared. "What you're looking at is a comparison of snow removal service before and after the ownership change. The first page shows photographs of driveway conditions. The second page shows homeowner satisfaction surveys. I got responses from 23 properties. The third page shows actual costs. I walked them through each section. The photos were damning, showing the massive snow walls that Danny had created compared to the clear driveways under my management. The satisfaction surveys showed a 96% approval rating. And the cost analysis showed that despite longer plow times, I was actually saving money by preventing property damage and reducing salt usage through more precise plowing. "The contract we have with the HOA pays Mountain Peak a flat seasonal rate," I explained. "It doesn't matter how long I spend plowing. The cost is the same whether I do it Danny's way or my way. The difference is in the quality of service." An older gentleman in the front row spoke up. "I've been here 12 years, and this is the first winter I haven't had to hire someone to clear the snow berm from my driveway. Blake's doing a great job." Others chimed in with agreement. The mood in the room was clearly in my favor. Brenda tried to regain control. "The conflict of interest remains a significant issue. We cannot have a homeowner providing services to the HOA. It creates an untenable situation." "Why?" I asked directly. "Your nephew providing services wasn't a conflict of interest, but a homeowner is. What's the actual concern here?" "The concern is proper governance and avoiding any appearance of impropriety." "Then maybe we should discuss the $15,000 in undocumented administrative expenses that George has been asking about for 2 months. The room went completely silent. Brenda's face drained of color. "Those expenses are properly categorized." "Then why can't George get documentation for them? He's the treasurer. He has a legal right to see those records." George stood up. "I've made 3 formal requests for documentation. Each time I've been told the records would be provided, but they never are. I'm beginning to think they don't exist." Patricia Lambert spoke up, looking nervous. "Brenda, do we have those records? Because I don't remember seeing any management consulting invoices." "They're filed with the rest of the financial documents." "Where?" George pressed. "Because I've reviewed every file we have and they're not there." Brenda's hands were shaking slightly. "I don't appreciate these accusations. Nobody's accusing you of anything," I said calmly. "We're just asking for documentation of how HOA funds are being spent. That's a reasonable request." A woman in the back stood up. "I move that we conduct a formal audit of the HOA finances for the past 3 years." "Second." Another homeowner called immediately. Brenda looked panicked. "That's not necessary. I can provide the records." "Then provide them now," George said. "You knew this meeting was coming. If you have the records, they should be here. They're at my home office." "Then let's table this vote for 1 hour while you go get them," I suggested. "If you can provide proper documentation, we don't need an audit." Brenda looked trapped. She couldn't refuse without making herself look more guilty, but clearly she didn't have the records to provide. "I'll need more than an hour." "How much more time?" George asked. "A few days. They need to be organized properly." You've had 2 months to organize them. I made my first request in January. George's calm demeanor was cracking slightly. Brenda, what's going on with this money? The silence stretched out. Finally, Patricia spoke quietly. Brenda, I think you need to tell us what those expenses are for. They're legitimate HOA business expenses. For what? We don't have a management company. We don't have consultants. What services are being paid for? Brenda gathered her papers abruptly. I don't have to sit here and be attacked. This meeting is adjourned. You can't adjourn an annual meeting early, someone called out. We haven't voted on board positions yet. Point of order, I said, standing up. We have a quorum of homeowners present. Even if the president leaves, we can continue the meeting and hold votes. That's in the bylaws. Brenda looked around the room and seemed to realize she'd lost control of the situation. Fine. Let's vote on the audit. The vote was unanimous. 28 properties voting in favor of a formal financial audit covering the past 3 years. Then came the vote on the snow removal contract. By a vote of 26-2, the homeowners approved continuing my contract for the next season at a reduced rate of $45,000 per year, a significant savings from what they'd been paying. Finally came the vote for board positions. All 3 seats were up for election annually. Brenda, Patricia, and George were the current members. I nominated George for treasurer again. A woman named Susan Larkins was nominated for president. A man named Robert Chen was nominated for vice president. Patricia nominated herself for secretary. Brenda nominated herself for president. The vote wasn't even close. Susan won the presidency with 24 votes. George was re-elected treasurer. Robert won vice president. Patricia got secretary because she was the only nominee. Brenda received 3 votes for president and was removed from the board entirely. I watched her face as the results were announced. The anger, the humiliation, the disbelief that her control had been stripped away so completely. She stood up and walked out without a word. The new board's first action was to hire an independent accounting firm to conduct the audit. The second action was to file a formal complaint with the county district attorney's office regarding potential embezzlement. Over the next month, the situation unfolded rapidly. The forensic accountant discovered that Brenda had been writing checks to herself from the HOA account for years, categorizing them as management consulting fees. In total, she'd taken nearly $17,000 over 3 years. When confronted by the district attorney's office, Brenda initially claimed the payments were authorized compensation for her work as HOA president. The problem was that the bylaws specifically stated board positions were unpaid volunteer roles. She then claimed she'd been confused about the rules. That excuse didn't hold up when the accountant found she'd been deliberately hiding the payments in vague expense categories. The DA ultimately charged her with theft and embezzlement. Given the amount and the evidence, her attorney advised her to take a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to a reduced charge, agreed to pay full restitution to the HOA plus penalties, and received 2 years of probation plus community service. Danny got caught up in it too. The investigation revealed that some of the money Brenda had taken had been kicked back to him through inflated invoicing for snow services. He was charged with fraud and also took a plea deal. The whole mess made the local papers. HOA president embezzles thousands, nephew involved in scheme, read one headline. It was a small-town scandal that people would be talking about for years. As for me, I continued running Mountain Peak snow services through that first season and decided to keep it going. With the reduced contract price and improved efficiency, the business was actually profitable. More importantly, I'd gained a reputation in the area for quality service. Other HOAs and commercial properties started reaching out, and within 6 months, I doubled the client base. I hired 2 employees to handle the daily operations, which freed me up to focus on my consulting business while maintaining oversight of Mountain Peak. It had turned from a revenge purchase into a legitimate business venture. Susan Larkins proved to be an excellent HOA president. She immediately implemented transparency measures, including monthly financial reports available online to all homeowners, regular community meetings, and a suggestion box for improvements. The HOA went from being something everyone dreaded to actually being a functional community organization. George stayed on as treasurer and made sure every penny was accounted for. Robert brought fresh ideas about community improvements. Even Patricia, once she was out from under Brenda's influence, became more engaged and helpful. The following winter, I made further improvements to the snow removal service. I invested in better equipment, implemented a notification system that alerted homeowners before plowing so they could move vehicles if needed, and even offered optional driveway clearing service at cost for elderly residents who couldn't do it themselves. The annual meeting that second year was completely different from the previous one. People were actually happy to attend. They voted to approve the HOA budget, thanked the board for their work, and several people specifically mentioned how much better the community felt now that the drama was gone. After the meeting, Susan pulled me aside. "You know, when you bought that Plow company, I thought you were crazy." I laughed. "So did my lawyer. But it worked. You exposed what was happening and helped turn this place around. I don't think any of us realized how bad things had gotten until you forced us all to pay attention." "I just wanted to dig out my driveway," I said. "No, you wanted things to be fair. There's a difference." She smiled. "The community's lucky to have you, even if you did take a very unusual path to get here." I drove back to my cabin that evening, the same route I'd taken countless times over the past year and a half. The roads were clear, my driveway was accessible, and when I pulled in, I sat for a moment appreciating the quiet. It had started with a wall of snow blocking my driveway and a HOA president who thought she was untouchable. It had escalated into a business acquisition, an investigation, and ultimately a complete restructuring of how the community was managed. It had cost me time, money, and stress. But sitting there in my driveway, knowing that I'd not only solved my own problem but improved things for 37 other families, it felt worth it. My phone buzzed with an email. It was from a HOA in Evergreen, about 20 miles away, asking if Mountain Peak Snow Services would be interested in bidding on their contract. Their current contractor had been regularly blocking driveways and ignoring complaints. The homeowners had heard about what happened in Pine Ridge and wondered if I'd be interested in helping them too. I smiled and started typing a response. Maybe this Snowplow business was turning into more than just a way to handle one problematic HOA. Maybe it was becoming a way to help communities get the service they actually deserved. 3 months later, in early spring, I received one final piece of correspondence related to the Brenda situation. It was a letter from her attorney, delivered to the HOA and CC'd to me. In it, she formally apologized for her actions and acknowledged the harm she'd caused to the community. The letter was clearly written by her lawyer as part of her probation requirements, but it provided official closure. The HOA board voted to accept the apology and considered the matter closed once full restitution was paid. They didn't want to drag things out any longer than necessary. The community had moved on, and everyone agreed that continuing to dwell on the past wouldn't help anyone. I found myself reflecting on the whole situation one evening while sitting on my cabin's deck, watching the sunset over the mountains. When I'd bought this place, I'd been looking for peace and quiet, an escape from the corporate world. Instead, I'd gotten pulled into small-town politics, HOA drama, and ultimately a complete business venture I'd never planned for. But as I looked at the view, at the cabin that had become a real home rather than just a retreat, I realized I wouldn't change any of it. Sometimes the detours life throws at you end up being more valuable than the path you originally planned. My consulting business was thriving. Mountain Peak Snow Services was growing steadily. I had good relationships with my neighbors in Pine Ridge. The HOA was functional and transparent. And my driveway never, ever got blocked by snow plows anymore. The next winter came and I was ready. Mountain Peak now served 5 different communities plus a dozen commercial clients. I'd expanded the fleet to 6 trucks and hired 4 full-time employees. What had started as a way to solve a personal problem had become a legitimate business helping hundreds of people. The first major snowfall of that second season came in early December. I rode along with one of my employees, Marcus, to make sure he understood the Pine Ridge route properly. We took our time, carefully angling each pass to avoid blocking driveways, using the designated snow storage areas, making extra passes where needed. When we finished the route just before dawn, I drove slowly through the community checking our work. Every driveway was clear. Every road was accessible. Every homeowner would wake up that morning and be able to leave their property without spending an hour digging out. It was a simple thing, really. Just doing the job properly, the way it should have been done all along. But it made a difference to people's daily lives, and that felt good. Marcus dropped me back at my cabin around 7 a.m. As I got out of the truck, I noticed an older couple from up the road, the Hendersons, already pulling out of their driveway. Mrs. Henderson waved at me with a big smile. "Thank you, Blake. Beautiful job as always." I waved back, watching them drive off to wherever their day was taking them. Such a simple interaction, but it represented everything that had changed. From being deliberately blocked in and ignored to being thanked for quality service. From a corrupt HOA president using her position for personal gain to an engaged community working together. I went inside and made coffee, looking at my calendar for the day. I had a consulting call with a client in Chicago at 9, a meeting with the accountant at 11 about Mountain Peak's expansion plans, and a Pine Ridge HOA Community Improvement Committee meeting that evening, where we'd discuss installing LED streetlights to improve safety and reduce energy costs. My life had become a blend of tech consulting and Snowplow company owner, Denver professional and Pine Ridge community member, business strategy and small-town politics. It wasn't what I'd planned, but it worked. The months passed smoothly. Winter progressed without any major incidents. The HOA continued to function well under Susan's leadership. Mountain Peak kept growing. By the time spring arrived and the snow finally stopped, I found myself already planning for the next season. In April, I got a call from Tom at the hardware store. "Blake, you've got to hear this." Danny Sheffield tried to start a landscaping business in Conifer. Got shut down within a month because his business practices were so shady. Word travels fast in these mountains. "Some people never learn," I said. "Yeah, well, karma's a thing." Meanwhile, I've had at least a dozen people ask about you in the past month. Your reputation's spreading. Good quality work and honest business practices stand out around here. That summer, I focused on building up Mountain Peak's off-season services. We added landscaping, property maintenance, and handyman services. Several Pine Ridge homeowners hired us for various projects. The business was becoming a year-round operation. I also made a point to stay engaged with the HOA. I attended meetings, participated in community events, and helped where I could. Not as the contractor, but as a neighbor and homeowner. That distinction mattered. In August, Susan announced she was moving to take a job in California. The HOA would need a new president. Several people approached me about running, but I declined. I'd learned that sometimes being involved doesn't mean being in charge. Instead, I supported Robert Chen for president, and he won easily. The transition was smooth, which demonstrated how far the HOA had come. It wasn't dependent on one person anymore. It had systems, transparency, and community buy-in. That was the real victory. As fall approached and I started preparing for the next winter season, I took some time to sit down and actually calculate what the whole adventure had cost me. Between the purchase price for Mountain Peak, the equipment upgrades, legal fees, time invested, and everything else, I'd spent about $275,000. On paper, the return on investment wasn't great yet. Mountain Peak was profitable, but not massively so. It would take years to recoup that initial investment through business operations alone, but that was never really the point. The value wasn't in the financial return. It was in the principle of the thing, in not letting corrupt people abuse their power, in helping a community function better. And honestly, in the satisfaction of watching Brenda's face when she realized I'd outmaneuvered her at every turn. Sometimes the best investments aren't the ones that make the most money. They're the ones that make life better in ways that can't be quantified on a balance sheet. The second full winter season began, and it went even more smoothly than the first. Mountain Peak's reputation continued to grow. We picked up 3 more HOA contracts in nearby communities. The team I'd built was solid, and the business largely ran itself with my oversight. In January, I ran into Patricia Lambert at the grocery store in town. We'd never been friendly exactly, but we'd reached a sort of mutual respect after everything that happened. "Blake, I wanted to thank you," she said, catching me by surprise. "For what?" "For having the courage to stand up to Brenda. I was her friend, but I was also complicit in a lot of what she did. I looked the other way when I should have asked questions. You forced all of us to do better." "I appreciate that, Patricia. Takes courage to acknowledge that." "I'm trying to do better now. Being secretary, actually caring about the HOA rather than just going along with whatever Brenda wanted. It feels good to be part of something positive." That conversation stuck with me. Change doesn't just happen to the obvious villains in a story. It ripples out, affecting everyone involved, giving people chances to become better versions of themselves. By the time my second annual meeting with Mountain Peak as contractor rolled around, the whole dynamic had changed. Instead of tension and conflict, there was appreciation and collaboration. The HOA thanked us for our service, approved the contract renewal, and several homeowners mentioned specific instances where we'd gone above and beyond. One woman shared a story about how Marcus had noticed her elderly father was having trouble with his front steps after a snowfall, and had cleared them without being asked. Another man talked about how we'd helped him locate a frozen pipe issue by noticing water on his driveway during a plow run. These weren't things we were contracted to do. They were just the kind of service that happens when you actually care about the community you're serving rather than seeing it as just another revenue source. After that meeting, I drove back to my cabin and spent some time on the deck, even though it was cold. The stars were incredibly bright that night, the way they only get in the mountains when the air is crisp and clear. I thought about the journey from that first morning when I'd woken up to find my driveway buried, to where I was now. It had been almost 2 full years of challenges, conflicts, business building, and community involvement. I'd learned more about HOA law, snow removal, small town dynamics, and myself than I ever expected to. The whole experience had taught me something valuable about how change happens. It's not usually through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, though those can be part of it. Real change happens through persistence, through refusing to accept that broken systems can't be fixed, through being willing to invest yourself in solutions even when they're difficult or costly. I could have just dealt with my blocked driveway each week. I could have sold my cabin and moved somewhere else. I could have filed complaints and lawsuits and let lawyers handle everything. Instead, I'd chosen to become part of the solution in a very direct way, and that had made all the difference. As spring approached again and the snow began to melt, I started planning for year 3. Mountain Peak was now serving 9 HOAs and about 30 commercial clients. We'd expanded to 12 employees and were looking at opening a second location in a neighboring county. What had started as an act of frustration had become a genuine business success. More importantly, Pine Ridge had become more than just my weekend cabin location. It was home. I knew my neighbors. I was part of the community. I had relationships and responsibilities there. The place had claimed me in a way I hadn't expected. In March, I got an email from someone who'd read about the Brenda situation in a community governance newsletter. They were a homeowner in Oregon dealing with similar HOA corruption and wanted advice on how to fight back. I spent an hour on the phone with them, sharing what I'd learned, what had worked, what I'd do differently. That led to more emails, more calls, more people reaching out for help with their own HOA problems. I started documenting my experience, writing up a guide on homeowner rights, HOA oversight, and how to challenge corrupt boards. I shared it freely with anyone who asked. It struck me that my story wasn't unique in its particulars. HOA abuse happened all over the country, in countless communities, affecting millions of people. What was unique was that I'd had the resources and stubbornness to fight back effectively. Most people didn't have that luxury, so I started thinking about how to help more people. I connected with attorneys who specialized in HOA law, with community organizers, with homeowner advocacy groups. I began putting together resources and networks that could help people who were facing similar situations, but didn't have the means to buy a plow company or hire expensive lawyers. It became something of a passion project, running parallel to my consulting business and Mountain Peak. I wasn't trying to become a crusader or an activist in any formal sense. I just wanted to help people understand their rights and know they had options when facing HOA problems. By the time summer rolled around again, I'd helped about 20 different homeowners in various states navigate their own HOA disputes. Some were minor issues that just needed proper documentation and formal complaints. Others were more serious, involving actual corruption that ultimately led to investigations. Not every story had a happy ending. Some HOAs were too entrenched, too well connected, or operating in states with laws that favored HOA boards over homeowners. But even in those cases, helping people understand they weren't alone and weren't crazy for thinking the system was broken, that had value. One evening in July, I was sitting on my cabin deck with George Hendricks, who'd become a good friend over the past 2 years. We were having beers and watching the sunset, talking about the upcoming HOA elections and community improvement projects. "You know what I appreciate most about what happened?" George said thoughtfully. "It's not just that Brenda got caught or that we have better HOA leadership now. It's that the community learned it has power. Before, everyone felt helpless. Now they know they can create change if they work together." "That's the real win," I agreed. "Systems only stay broken if people let them." Still, It took you being willing to invest $250,000 in a snowplow company to crack it open. Not many people can do that. True. Which is why I'm trying to help others find different paths that don't require that kind of investment. There are usually options. People just don't know what they are. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the colors change across the mountains as the sun dipped lower. This had become my favorite time of day at the cabin, when the world quieted down and you could just exist in the moment. "Think you'll ever sell Mountain Peak?" George asked eventually. I'd considered it. The business was worth significantly more now than what I'd paid for it. I could probably sell it for $500,000 or more, turning a decent profit. But every time I seriously thought about it, I came back to the same conclusion. "No," I said. "It's not about the money anymore. It's about maintaining something good, you know. We've built trust with these communities. We provide real value. Selling it to someone who might just see dollar signs and cut corners, that would feel like betraying what we've created." George nodded. "That's what I thought you'd say. You're not in this for a quick profit. Never were." The rest of that summer was peaceful. Mountain Peak kept operating smoothly with my team handling daily operations. My consulting business was strong. The Pine Ridge HOA continued to function well. Life had found a comfortable rhythm. Then October brought an unexpected development. A local news reporter contacted me wanting to do a story about the HOA situation and how it had resolved. She'd been investigating HOA corruption as part of a broader series and wanted to feature Pine Ridge as an example of successful community pushback. I was hesitant at first. The whole point had been to solve the problem and move on, not to become some kind of public figure. But after talking with Susan, Robert, and George, we decided it might help other communities to see what was possible. The reporter, Amanda Chen, spent 2 weeks interviewing people in Pine Ridge, reviewing documents and putting together the story. When it aired on the local Denver news station and was posted online, the response was overwhelming. My phone didn't stop ringing for 3 days. HOA homeowners from across Colorado and neighboring states were calling, emailing, reaching out however they could. Everyone had their own horror story. Everyone wanted to know how to fight back. I couldn't possibly help everyone personally, but I used the attention to push for some actual change. I connected with state legislators about HOA reform legislation. I helped establish a homeowner advocacy group that could provide resources and support. I wrote op-eds about the need for better oversight and accountability in HOA governance. It was never my intention to become an advocate for HOA reform, but somehow that's what happened. All because I'd refused to accept a blocked driveway and a corrupt HOA president. As my third winter with Mountain Peak approached, I took stock of where things stood. The business was thriving and had become a respected service provider across the region. My relationships in Pine Ridge were strong. The HOA was functioning well. I'd helped dozens of other homeowners with their own situations, and I'd maintained my consulting business throughout all of it. It was a lot to juggle, but it was fulfilling in a way my previous life hadn't been. Before, I'd been successful but somewhat disconnected, building wealth but not necessarily building meaning. Now I felt connected to something larger than myself. The third winter season was the smoothest yet. Mountain Peak ran like a well-oiled machine. The communities we served were happy. The employees were well-trained and motivated. I'd finally reached the point where the business didn't need my constant attention, which freed me up to focus on the advocacy work and my consulting. In February, the state legislature actually passed a bill strengthening homeowner rights and requiring greater HOA transparency. It wasn't everything advocates had hoped for, but it was a significant step forward. I testified at one of the committee hearings, sharing the Pine Ridge story as an example of what could go wrong without proper oversight. When the bill passed, several legislators specifically mentioned how hearing from real homeowners about real problems had helped build support. Apparently, my testimony and the testimony of others I'd helped organize had made a difference. It was a strange feeling, realizing that my frustration with a blocked driveway had ultimately contributed to actual legal reform that would help thousands of homeowners across the state. That's not how I'd expected any of this to go. As spring arrived again and the snow melted, I found myself reflecting on the full 3-year journey. From that first morning of waking up to 6 feet of snow blocking my exit, through buying the Plow company, exposing HOA corruption, building a successful business, helping other homeowners, and contributing to legislative reform. It had been quite a ride, and it all came down to a simple decision. I could accept the situation as it was, or I could do something about it. I'd chosen to do something, and that had made all the difference. On a warm April evening, the Pine Ridge HOA held a community barbecue. It had become an annual tradition since Susan had started it 2 years earlier, a way for neighbors to connect and celebrate the community. As I stood there with a plate of food, talking with people who'd become genuine friends, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what community was supposed to feel like. People caring about each other, working together, holding leadership accountable but also supporting them. It wasn't perfect, there were still disagreements and challenges, but the fundamental dynamic was healthy now. Robert Chen clinked his beer bottle against mine. To Blake Morrison, the man who bought a Snowplow company just to prove a point, I laughed. That makes it sound more dramatic than it was. Are you kidding? It was incredibly dramatic and effective, and completely insane, he grinned. Best kind of solution. As the sun set and the party continued, I looked around at the community that had changed so much in 3 years. Better HOA leadership, quality services, engaged homeowners, and a sense that things actually worked the way they were supposed to. All because someone had pushed back against a corrupt system instead of just accepting it. My cabin driveway never got buried anymore. Mountain Peak made sure of that, along with every other driveway in every community we served. Such a simple thing, but it represented something much larger. The idea that services should serve people, that leadership should be accountable, and that corruption could be challenged and defeated. It had cost me time, money, and considerable effort. But sitting there at that community barbecue, surrounded by neighbors who'd become friends, running a business that provided real value, having contributed to reforms that helped thousands of people, I couldn't imagine having made any other choice. Sometimes the best decisions in life are the ones that seem completely unreasonable at the time. Sometimes buying a Snowplow company to spite your HOA president turns out to be the start of something much more meaningful than you ever imagined. And sometimes a blocked driveway is the beginning of a journey that changes not just your own life, but an entire community and beyond. The evening wound down, people heading home, promising to see each other at the next HOA meeting or around the neighborhood. I drove the short distance back to my cabin, parked in my always clear driveway, and sat for a moment looking at the stars. 3 years ago, I'd been a successful consultant with a weekend cabin and a frustrating HOA problem. Now I was still a successful consultant, but also a small business owner, a community advocate, and someone who'd learned that sometimes the crazy solution is the right solution. My phone buzzed with an email. Another homeowner from another state, asking for advice about their HOA situation. I smiled and made a note to respond in the morning. The work continued, helping people find their own paths to standing up for themselves and their communities. As I finally headed inside, I took one last look at my driveway, clear and accessible, just as it should be. Such a simple thing, but it had sparked everything that followed. Sometimes that's how change works. You start with something small, something personal, and if you're willing to see it through, it becomes something much larger than you ever intended. And that, I thought as I closed the door behind me, was a pretty good outcome for a story that started with nothing more than too much snow and not enough patience for corrupt HOA presidents.